So what I want to do in preparation for our discussion of Meister Eckhart's work is to lead you through a little bit of intellectual and cultural history, so as to give you some kind of characterization for what was going on during the Middle Ages and what happened ultimately in the late Middle Ages and how it is that set the stage for the Renaissance and then the emergence therein of the modern worldview. This is something that is often not discussed in great detail, and we can't afford to spend too much time with it. But this lecture is the primary time in this course that we're going to be able to discuss these things. So, okay, first, to give you some idea of what's going on, one of the ways of characterizing the movement in the medieval world is in terms of a change in the concept of the individual, a change in the concept of knowledge, and then also as an extension of knowledge, what the physical world actually is. So this is in a very real sense a set of fundamental changes of self and world understanding. Self in the individual, the conception of the individual, and then world in the conception of the physical world and what it means to be able to know things, i.e. about the physical world, primarily. So by the time we get to modern science, we're talking about a very physicalist, a very materialist conception of the world, one where efficient causes are dominant. So we conceive of the world as principally moving by way of physical causes, very deterministic, mechanistic physical causes. And we think of knowledge specifically with respect to this kind of thing. And there is a curious, and honestly, you can learn a lot by just looking at the way that knowledge is used in the modern world and trying to understand all of the different pieces that go into it, because we use the word in a variety of different ways. One of the ways is with respect to scientific knowledge, and we might even say, in order to separate it, that this is scientific knowledge that we're talking about as opposed to some other kind of knowledge. So other societies have had multiple words for this, but we've compressed it into a single word. So when we're talking about knowledge, let's say knowledge of oneself, we might say that one comes to know something about oneself, but it's a very hazy sort of conception, and it's not one that's necessarily, if at all, tied with the other kind of knowledge about the physical world. And so by the time we get to the modern period, that the kind of knowledge that we primarily think of when someone says knowledge is, instructions of how to build a bookshelf, or, the mechanical laws of motion, let's say, or that sort of thing. And we're not so much thinking of it in terms of the health and well-being of the individual. Whereas in the ancient world, knowledge was tied intimately with the health and well-being of the individual. And as we saw in Plato, as one gains in knowledge, you rise in ontological status. I mean, you become something different. And this participation in the higher forms is participation in things that are of higher ontological status. In other words, literally more reality. And so there was a natural connotation of health associated with knowledge, and then the converse is true as well. So how do we bridge these two worlds? Well, this happened during the medieval period. And what we see is a slow change in the conception of what knowledge is. Now, one of the things that I like to mention in connection with this is the idea of adequation, or adequatio in Latin. And so this refers to a match, where our intellect is a match for, appropriate to, the physical world. In other words, the physical world was a given in classical antiquity, and while we could be deceived in various ways, there was no thought that we were going to be just completely deceived. You didn't have anything like Descartes' evil demon trying to fool you into thinking that there's a world out there when in reality it's not, or it's all in your head, or something of the kind. I mean, these are much more modern conceptions. And that room for doubt of the physical world had to be made over the course of the medieval period. Now, there's a further piece here. There was the thought, especially dominant in Christianity, that the world was appropriate to us and that nature did not need fixing in the same way. So for the classical Greeks, nature was nature, and, we might have certain power that we can exercise in one way or another, but fundamentally the world was what it was. There was no sense that we need to fix the world. Now, By the time we reach Augustine, of course, and we start thinking about original sin, his concept, and moving forward with the Christian notion of the fall, then nature does start to look different. And again, this is something that plays on a Platonic conception. So in Plato, remember, you had more or less the rational world. The rational portion of the soul was the one that Plato identified as the right governor of the soul. That's the portion of the soul that the philosopher, the wise man, should identify with, encourage, and ultimately lead to rule his soul. So the soul was conceived of as, kind of warring factions. So you had the desires forcing you in a certain direction, the appetites, and, you had rationality pulling you in a different direction, and so on. And this is incidentally a very modern psychological conception of it. We're returning to this sort of thing now, which is kind of amusing to see, contra the existentialists, especially Jean-Paul Sartre. So anyway, his idea of absolute freedom is absolutely not compatible with the Platonic conception of the soul, nor is it compatible with the medieval conception of free will, incidentally, but we'll talk about that. For Plato, to know the forms was to gain in health. And so later, as we move into the medieval period, as nature is no longer thought to be as appropriate, as perfect, or as, good in itself, the thought arises that nature needs correction. And this can only arise if once the teleological conception of how the natural world functions begins to fall away. Now, if you've ever wondered why it is that modern physics and the conception of modern mechanistic mathematical laws in terms of governing motion, how in the world did people not notice this thousands of years earlier? Well, this is one of the reasons. They were inclined more to teleological thinking. And specifically, we think about teleological thinking with respect to Aristotle. And so the telos is the final cause. So Aristotle had a number of causes, explanations. The word aitia really is probably closer to description or explanation than it is to cause for us. But nevertheless, they're called the four causes, one of which is the final cause. The final cause is the why of something. Why is something there? And if a natural object or a natural thing. So let's think even of an animal. You have like a beaver, and the beaver has a why to its existence, in addition to all of the other things that we recognize in biology, which correspond roughly to Aristotle's other causes: formal, material, and efficient. So the beaver has a certain form. It's made out of a certain stuff, and it's, in other words, a certain form, as in its cells and its chemicals are arranged in a certain way. And there are certain efficient causes that go about creating it and sustaining it in terms of eating and sleeping and this sort of thing. And finally, there is the final cause, the why of its existence. And we can see, and biology incidentally still does use some teleological language, which is interesting, but we simply don't have the time to go into that here. It's not directly relevant to what we're studying, but it is salient. So teleological language with respect to the beaver might be, well, he builds his dams so that he can change the landscape. And by changing the landscape, he actually enables the flourishing of life in a variety of ways. So you dam up a river in a certain place, and that water has to go somewhere. It gets redirected and, fertilizes the soil or whatever it might happen to do. And so he is, in other words, he serves a purpose in his ecological niche. So in his ecosystem, and this is how biology does it, right? This is a teleological description of things. We say that the beaver serves a particular function in his ecosystem. And that talk like that way of speaking is a way of speaking that indicates that this creature has a certain purpose, and he is serving his purpose just fine without us, so don't mess with it. And this is frequently what we hear in some environmentalist rhetoric, right? Is that the balance in terms of ecosystems and whatnot is such that, we shouldn't necessarily genetically modify things in certain ways because this is going to offset the balance and such and such. I'm not here to talk about those arguments in the slightest, but merely I'm trying to point out with that example that this is an instance of teleological thinking in modern biology. And so, in conceiving of a creature as having a why, we are inclined to say, well, it has a purpose, so, don't mess with it. And it is what it is. It is the kind of thing that it is. It's made out of the stuff that it is, and it serves the purpose that it serves. Well, if you think about the world, the natural world, in those terms, then there's no real need to correct the natural world. And one instance of this, which is really kind of interesting, is that of eyeglasses, corrective lenses. We had the technology to do this long before people really did it. And perhaps this is the story, right? This is a fairly famous example. The reason that we didn't is because, my eyes serve the purpose that they serve. And if they come to a certain imperfection with respect to, myopia, and they don't see very well, then, this is still part of the natural order, part of God's creation. And so, why should I be so arrogant as to think that I should correct part of God's creation? Well, obviously, we eventually moved on to saying that, the eye's not really serving its function very well, so let's fix this. And this tends to be a much more modern approach to things, and a much more, we don't even have to say necessarily modern, even Renaissance approach to things, much more centered on the individual and the individual's function and well-being within a natural environment that is not necessarily kind to him, and that can in fact be hostile or indifferent to him. So the idea that the natural world needs some kind of correction is also a salient detail of that's going to emerge from this period. And what this required was an unseating of Aristotle in his physics. And Aristotle's physics, we're talking about, roughly 350 BC or so here, 300 BC, 1400, 1500 years later, we're still trying to crawl out from under the dominance of this notion of the physical world. And his description of motion is particularly different from ours in terms of having to require a constant impetus, constant push to keep things going. But nevertheless, so Aristotelian physics had a foothold for a very, very long time. He was, just right about this, evidently. And part of his physics was the teleology, the ascription of why purposes to things. And so this was much more a portion of the worldview that dominated in ancient Greece. As I mentioned, a more archetypal worldview, one that was focused not on linear time so much as stability of things, and the stability of the natural world, the acquiescence to the natural world, the acceptance of the natural world as it was, unquestioning in some ways, not trying to correct everything. Is a much more modern view on things. And so what we see is with the ancient and with the archetypal, the traditional societies, a much more passivity with respect to the individual. So the individual is more passive with respect to his or her own individuality. And the idea is that individuality must be modified, i.e. annihilated, one might even say. And this is the term that's used, for instance, in Marguerite Porret's work. And we also see the same thing in Meister Eckhart's writings. These are all at about the same time. Marguerite Porret was burned at the stake in the first decade, at the end of the first decade of the 14th century. Eckhart would have been writing around the same time, but he didn't suffer that fate. Nevertheless, so annihilation of the soul, annihilation of the individual. With Augustine, we hear about the annihilation of the individual will. And so the idea of humility in Christianity, not a Greek virtue, but the idea of humility in Christianity was very much one of acquiescence, one of giving oneself over, giving one's will over to God and letting God's will go. And this is very much one of letting the world be as it is, not trying to correct it so much, not trying to assert one's own individual will. And this self-assertion, this will to self-assertion, is something that characterizes what arises in the Renaissance and what enables us to move on to a modern conception of society by way of a modern conception of the individual. Okay, so the active-passive thing is one thing that's going to come up. That's certainly going to be a big issue, because in Christian monasticism, as characterized all the way through the first millennium, monasticism is fundamentally contemplative. It's fundamentally passive in this way. And so one goes to cloister oneself away, to get away from all of the not only temptations, but distractions and otherwise, incoming difficulties presented by being in normal society, remove all sense of property and whatnot, and in all of the things that we might be attached to and desire. in favor of contemplation, passivity, and ultimately the developing of a knowledge, a oneness with the divine, however you want to describe it, and the various ways that's described, of course, are very important in terms of characterizing the different eras. Whether they're actually different and they actually refer to different experiences is, of course, an open question, one that is certainly something of a debate. And I have to smile in saying this because this is a debate that I'm particularly sensitive to, particularly interested in. And this is going to be, with respect to especially, and you'll hear about this when we talk about the perennial philosophy, the idea of constants and constants in religious history. Do we have a core natural religion? Do we have a core set of experiences and or anything that constitutes religion, or do we have really very different things that cannot be compared, that are not commensurate in that way? So anyway, moving into the medieval world, another thing that has to be emphasized, and this is absolutely crucial for understanding the rise in the Renaissance thinking and the modern scientific viewpoint, is the notion of creativity. And the idea for the ancients is that the individual doesn't create, that the province of creation is God. God's province is creation. So that's his ability, that's his thing, and the individual doesn't do this in a substantial way. And so there is no new. The idea of creation is wrapped up with novelty. In other words, if I think that I am creating something, the idea is that I'm creating something that is new. I'm not simply rearranging things so that we have yet another instance of, something that's old. Because in the classical world and traditional societies, the emphasis would be on what is archetypal, what is eternal. And so I am creating a, let's say ritual object of a kind, one of thousands, presumably extending forever into history, that have been created, and the world renews itself and is, very constant in this way. And so there is no notion that I'm creating something new. I am actually creating something old. So I am assembling something so that I can have an instance of what is really eternal. And so the emphasis there is on the eternal, not on the new. And part of the move to linear history is to emphasize the new, to emphasize and to valorize. In other words, to give value to say it's actually a good thing for things to be new. One of the things that you'll notice with Eckhart, and this is also true for Cusanus even, so even extending into the 15th century, there's a thought that, well, we've already kind of got it. We've already got the tradition that we need. We've already got the theology. We already have the, religion. We already have the view of the world that we need. And so novelty is an offense to that kind of system. And any kind of curiositas, in the Latin, that leads us to novelty is likewise going to be anathema to what it is that we really should be doing. And so curiosity that leads to an investigation of things that otherwise are useless, that are not, worthy of pursuit, and then curiosity that leads to individual creativity. These are notions that are very much at odds with the classical world. And so part of understanding what happens during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance is the emergence of this notion of individual creativity. Now, it would be I think a gross misrepresentation to say that individual creativity simply had to be set free, as though it were always there and it was just being restrained and held down. And this is kind of the story that we hear from some. And this was a very popular sort of rhetoric, especially in later years. So by the time that we had already arrived at this sort of thinking, and I'm thinking of Bacon in particular, that the rhetoric of, we have to, set free individual creativity. We have to set free individual genius. And individual genius, incidentally, is wrapped up intimately with individual creativity. So the value of the individual qua individual, in other words, as an individual, is wrapped up with the idea of the individual as being able to create something, because someone who creates something presumably is valuable because they were able to create something. In other words, we think about Einstein, we think about his genius, we think about his value, our esteem of him, in other words, and we are typically thinking about his accomplishments with respect to creating new theory in physics. And so this kind of thing had to be prepared for. It was not as though people always valued this stuff and it was just held down by the iron grip of, the papacy or the whatever. That's just simply not the case. The culture had to change to enable the possibility for creativity to even be a good thing, for the creation of something new to even be a good thing. And I hope you can see the tie with linear history, the transition from archetypal or nonlinear history, atemporality, to linear history. I hope you can see how it is that that's tied with individual creativity, because in an archetypal society, there's no room for creativity. There's no room for individual genius, because the individual is not what's important. The new, the contingent thing is not what's important. What's important is what's eternal. But for linear history, and especially as manifest by the time of the Renaissance, what becomes important is the individual creative genius and new ideas, genuine novelty. And this is something that we had to do a lot of work. There had to be a lot of change in terms of cultural values and the way that people were thinking about things. So again, self and world understanding. The way that we understood the world had to change. And what we're going to see by the time we get to Nicholas of Cusa is that we also had to be thinking in terms of approximation. In other words, it wasn't just that the natural world was given to us, it's that we had an approximate knowledge, so that the knowledge that I have, the conception that I have of how something works, is not the thing itself. I'm not participating in the thing itself. By doing that, I'm forming my own model or my own theory about it. It's an approximation, and it can always be improved. That ability to always be improved ad infinitum is something that we're going to hear in Nicholas of Cusa almost for the first time, arguably, in the 15th century. And before that, we really know nothing of this sort of thing. The world is what it is, and there is no sense that we can come to know infinitely more about a tree than we already know simply by looking at it. I mean, you look at it, it's a tree, got it, done. But in later times, observation and novelty in terms of theory and understanding, there's always more, they will say, Nicholas of Cusa says, that we can know about any individual thing in the universe. And so what this is a reversal, and we'll talk about this next time. What this is a reversal of the infinite being applied to the external world, and the infinite then gets applied to the smallest piece of the world. And so before we could conceive of an absolutely infinite world or an absolutely infinite whatever, the absolutely infinite incidentally is God, because this doesn't include just the physical world, so it's not just pantheism, but all possibility, all being, all non-being, all whatever, and the universe. And so the movement is from that to the intensively infinite, in other words, seeing the individual as valuable in and of itself, and the individual as rich and as worthwhile in and of itself. Because remember, in the archetypal societies, for Plato especially, the manifestations of the individual things are of a lesser state in all cases than the eternal forms. And so the individual as an individual doesn't have significance. The individual has significance only insofar as it relates to the eternal. And this is something that's going to change. And the period of the medieval world, especially in the late medieval world, approaching the Renaissance, is where we see this change in action. This is the significance of a figure like Meister Eckhart. And so I want you to keep that story in mind as we're reading Eckhart, because a lot of what Eckhart has to say is decidedly different than what people have said before, not in terms of theology so much as his way of expressing things. And his way of expressing things is unique to his time, which is a harbinger of things to come in the Renaissance. A few more historical notes are worth adding before we plunge into a discussion of Eckhart proper. First, in the Islamic world, we see a flourishing at the same time that we do not see that. We have the Dark Ages, so to speak, in the European world. And because of this, we have a lot of even Greek philosophy preserved by translation into Arabic and use in that world. And so there's an influx of culture, and there is a preservation even of a lot of classical culture just south of Europe in the Islamic world. And so figures that loom large in this transition, just briefly, are those like, for instance, Avicenna or Averroes. And these are philosophers and thinkers who would adopt, in certain measure, Aristotle in particular, and Greek philosophical ideas, and allowed for then their promulgation and diffusion again once into Western society. And so Averroes is particularly well known for this, and there's an Averroist controversy with respect to the immortality of the soul, because Aristotle, for instance, the immortality of the soul was not the immortality of the individual soul. And so this creates a certain measure of difficulty with respect to Christian dogma, and incidentally with the Muslim world as well. So nevertheless, there was a suspicion that even though it was exciting to get in contact with these ideas, there was something that was foreign about them. And big surprise, right? I mean, this is a very, very long time ago. I mean, you're talking about preservation of a tradition that's already, upwards of 1,500 years old. And so we should expect it to be from a somewhat different cultural complex, even though geographically we're talking about a very similar region. And so Aristotle, even though Plato, there was an established tradition of Platonism, and Plato had been preserved not necessarily in his own writings, so people were not reading Plato directly so much as they were reading Neoplatonist works, and they were reading others who had been influenced by Plato, for instance, Roman thinkers. And so for many centuries, the education of those who could get an education consisted in large measure of reading a lot of works that were certainly still echoing a lot of these same Platonic and Greek sentiments. Aristotle was not preserved as well, which is why it's significant that he comes to us by way of, or comes back to the Western world, the European world, European cultural complex, by way of Islamic sources. And so there was a controversy. And when we see the earliest universities arising in the, let's say, 11th century, it's not long after that we start seeing the people that I mentioned and the ideas of Aristotle, the ideas that were not already entrenched in Western Christianity resurface and be provocative, but at the same time also create a certain degree of controversy. And this was certainly the case and perhaps peaked in the 13th century. And in the 13th century, we think of a figure like Thomas Aquinas as contributing greatly to the acceptance of Aristotle within Catholicism. And so this is one of Aquinas's big projects, is harmonizing, synthesizing reason and faith in Christianity. And so during the 13th century, we see an influx of Aristotelian ideas again, and by way of Aquinas, these ideas are made palatable once again to the West. And so there was a significant controversy, let's say, even a few years after Aquinas died, which was in 1274. By 1277, and again a few years later, you had lists of his propositions that were condemned. And there were a lot of people who were, outraged and speaking against Aquinas and trying to get his work censored in various ways. And ultimately, it didn't work. And there were theologians, we were told, that, basically had to eat their words, because Aquinas was made Saint Thomas Aquinas. He was canonized in 1323. And so this is not very long after his death, relatively speaking. I mean, some people, it takes a very long time for them to actually become recognized as saints. And so there was a battle, more or less. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, and the Dominicans, of course, fought hard for Aquinas and won, clearly. So that's part of the background.